Tonight we're going to review days 1 through 3 real briefly. We're going to finish up day 4. We're going to cover day 5 of creation, and then we are going to take all the themes and the language that we have looked at, and we are going to take a look at the undoing of creation towards the end. So let's remind ourselves of what those themes and that language was. Now, the reason why I have felt the past 2 sessions that it's really difficult to teach something that is so extensive that you can't wrap it up in an hour and a half at a meeting. And there's all these loose ends hanging out there. And I keep struggling with how do I present these chunks so that you can just kind of get a hold of each one of those. And I got to thinking, this is why it's important to stop and review every once in a while. And I think it's also important for your homework last week, I had asked you to start memorizing some things. And I think that having those things memorized will help you to take all these disparate pieces that we're talking about and fit them into a framework in your own mind. And then for my analogy, it's like, this is like a gigantic puzzle, not one of those little wooden puzzles that it took you 20 minutes to put together when you were a little kid. This is like one of those 5,000 piece jigsaw puzzles that takes up the entire kitchen table for 3 years as you're trying to put the thing together. And I feel like what we're doing right now when we're covering the 7 days of creation is we're looking at little pieces out of this huge box, and we're trying to examine every little part, the shape of them, the colors on them, and then every once in a while I'll stop and I'll kind of extend out, I'll poke out into some of those other areas that we're going to be examining, like the letters in Revelation or a feast day. And you'll begin to see how, okay, this piece, and this piece, those fit together, and you end up with little chunks of the puzzle. Eventually, we'll get, we'll get a lot of it put together, eventually, hopefully. Maybe just the edge pieces or something. But
the edge pieces that people can work from there.
Yeah. And as we do this, I think building that framework, a puzzle gets easier and easier the more of it you get put together, because there's fewer pieces left and there's more reference points to attach the rest of the pieces in the box to. So hopefully, even if we don't end up finishing workbook 1, which I hope we do, you can take off from there and have enough in that framework to start attaching things on your own, and kind of a method for doing it. So let's start our review. Okay, day 1. Okay, day 1, our key things were let there be light. That's what God said, and then light was. So light was obeying the word of God by being. And then God sees that light is good, and he separates the light from the darkness. Okay, and we looked at how that was kind of a picture of the Israelites in Egypt being separated out because they obeyed and they were good. We had the terms introduced of night, day, evening, morning, and kind of the boundaries for what a day, how a day is defined, were established on that day 1. Then on day 2, we looked at the separation of the waters, the upper waters and the lower waters, and that theme of that reflection of the heavenly on what is down below, like the pattern Moses saw in heaven being not duplicated like a sky reflected in water where it looks exactly the same, because you have something spiritual being reflected into the physical. So it gets a little abstract there. We also looked at, in between those, there is the expanse. And the word for that was rakia. And there were, that's going to be the dwelling place. That's going to be where the birds and man and the beasts reside. And it's also big enough to where that's going to be where the stars, moon, and sun are placed in that expanse. Now, on day 3, we had the waters gathered and the dry land appear, and then out of the dry land come the plants and the trees. And there was some repeated language in there that the trees were yielding seed, bearing fruit after their own kind. And those were important concepts to attach to that day. That this day is also a picture of resurrection, because those gathered waters, the first step that happens on day 3, the word for that is mikvah, gathering of waters. And so just like our idea of baptism, where you have a mikvah and you go under and you come out, the whole thing was covered in water, a mikvah. And as the waters were mikvahed, you had the dry land emerge and the plants emerge, and then out of the dry land. And so the resurrection theme, I think we saw most clearly in that verse where, unless a seed falls into the earth and dies, then it remains alone. But then if it sprouts and it bears much fruit, something to that effect. That's not exact wording there. So then we went to day 4, and I wanted to pick up there. I felt like that was a little bit of a mess last time. I apologize for that. I wanted to review that the lights in the expanse were, there was 3 main things to fix in your head, and that was they were there to give light, to separate the day from the night, or the light from the darkness, and to govern, or mashal. And we looked at that term mashal and how that also is the word used for parable. And so when we looked specifically at the language for the day 4 of creation, we spotted a chiasm there, and it involves our 3 things: the separate, the give, and the mashal. And that mashal, that govern, that's in red right there, that was chiastically connected to the signs and the seasons and the days and the years. And we talked about how you can kind of see the Moedim, or the feast days, being a parable that we walk out, being a thing that helps us to understand really difficult things and mysterious things. We also saw in this chiasm, when we looked at what was contained in the middle, where it says he made the stars also, that this could be seen as a prophecy about Israel, or Abraham's descendants, who were the stars in the rakia, and that his descendants would give light on the earth, would mashal, or govern darkness and light, by keeping those feast days, and would separate light from darkness, distinguish between those 2 things by obeying the voice from the mountain and keeping the commandments. So we also talked about that the 4th, because we're using the menorah as our pattern, that the 4th, because it's centered, it is connected to everything else. And we saw that in this day 4 of creation, you have the elements of light and dark pulled in from day 1. You have the expanse, where the lights are placed, pulled in from day 2. You have the light that is given on the earth and the plants from day 3. And then once we go forward, you'll see that day 5, you have great numbers of things being created that move. And so when you think about the number of the stars, the number of the lights that were put in the rakia, and that's our calendar. That's where time starts to move. So this movement in great numbers from day 4 is extended into day 5. And then that governing idea, ruling, we see that on day 6 when you have man has dominion over all the creatures, the birds and the fish, everything that that moves. So I wanted to keep going with that, and I know this door thing and the authority thing was well done last week, but I'm going to keep going. So, because there's still this, because this is 4, it's pivotal. It's just, you look, it's in the middle. So I think that's important to see how much this really extends out.
If you don't mind my interrupting, does anyone, what would you say about why the 4 is so pivotal? I don't know that we've really discussed that to any great length, but who would say
Tracy did.
Yes, if you read the paper that I sent out this week from Tracy, then you would definitely recognize the significance of 4. But does anybody know? Would anybody say why the 4th in the series is so critical? Aiden?
It's in the middle.
Well, it being in the middle is certainly important. What's that? It's taller than the others. Those are symbols that represent why it might be important. Lou?
Well, isn't it the foundation for everything else?
In a sense, you could say it
4
was.
corners of the earth.
Yeah, absolutely. What'd you say, John?
Oh, it also represents, of course, Yeshua.
Yeshua is definitely represented as a 4th.
Well, I'm thinking of 40 being the number of judgment of the righteous.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of really significant things about the number 4, and that's why I think you're spending so much time dealing with the number 4. I mean, it's that center stick in the menorah. Yeah, there's so many ideas, and the number 4 is just really critical because everything seems to branch out from it.
And I think there's a lot to be learned there about entry into the kingdom, because that 4 is the door. That's, if you want to look at that middle branch of the menorah and try to envision your mind a portal back to the garden right there. So keep that in mind as we talk about doors and authority a little bit more.
Remember to change over to the screen so you can see everyone when you're not using your presentation.
Yes, I'd like to see
And the Bible says something about Jesus is the door. In other words, you're not going to, and basically not going to get saved unless you call on Him, and He's the one that opens the door of salvation to your
Right.
heart.
Yeah.
Right.
And also no animals or plants are created on that day.
Right.
It is only,
The
it
moon
talks
is-
again the celestial bodies.
Right. Which are created to rule the day and the night.
Right.
So yeah, you got to rule.
To rule and to serve.
Yeah.
They give and they rule over, which is a picture of Messiah, ruling but also being a servant.
Yeah, right.
So,
Critical day.
I think Shavuot being the giving of the Torah and the Spirit is also a pivotal piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool, I digress, sorry. Carla. Oh,
he
she's
can't
not-
hear, she
she's not
can't
here.
hear.
Yeah, sorry.
Me or them? Them.
Yes, it's my fault, Carla. I
He dropped
apologize.
the ball with the
I'm
microphone.
slacking on my job.
Sign language.
Yeah, if you want to say something, please do get the mic over there. Just as a
Yeah,
reminder.
because you guys say really good stuff, and they want to
Yeah,
hear that
absolutely.
stuff. Okay, all right. Now, last week when we were talking about door, I said there's more than one word used for that, and I kind of explored that a little bit this week, just a little. And just like we have doorposts, lintel, the door, the actual door, and the doorway, which is the hole that you go through, there's different Hebrew words for those. But I think just they occur together so often, and it's the same theme there, that I don't think at this point, unless somebody would like to pick up with that and break it down, and look at those different pieces and how, what the significance is when the different pieces of that entry are used, that would be fantastic. But for now, we're just going to speak to doors. So this thing with a door allows people into your house, or it keeps people out of your house. So there's this idea of authorization to enter or not. And a lot of times you'll see keys come up too, because key goes to the door. So that's just another aspect of this whole thing. Now, there's that verse that said that when Yeshua's talking to the disciples, and they're saying that some people say that the Son of Man is Elijah, and some people say that the Son of Man is, and he looks at his disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Son of God." I don't know the exact wording. You remember the verse, correct? And at that point, Yeshua says to him that he is giving him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. That whatever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever he looses on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that is him giving Peter some really serious authority right there, the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And why? Because he identified Yeshua as the authority. And so when you see a failure to attribute authority where it belongs, you see blindness coming up over and over again. We saw it, well, if you think about the thing where Jacob takes the blessing instead of Esau, Isaac is fooled because Isaac can't see very well. So there's a blindness there when you had that flip of authority. When Korah came up to the tent of meeting in his rebellion that we talked about last week against Moses, who was the authority, given authority by God, Korah had made that strange statement in the middle of his, "I just won't do it," where he said, "Will you put out the eyes of these men?" It's kind of weird because Moses never threatened to blind anyone. We talked about Paul on the road to Damascus last week, that it said, what's his name, Ananias? Ananias said, "This man came from Jerusalem with the authority of the chief priests." And he was afraid to go to him. Paul was struck with blindness. His authority went from that granted by the chief priests to that given by Messiah. And that's when his sight is restored. And then we saw the people of Sodom as they try to break down the door, that they are struck with blindness. So it's little wonder that the concepts of authority or governing and blindness are connected, because on that fourth day you have that they govern and that they give light. And if you don't attribute authority to the correct place, your light is taken away, which means you cannot see. You're in darkness. So it's not really that surprising that those two things to go together, but I wanted you to see that the seed of that is on day 4. Okay. We are going to, I'm going to switch the slide. I go back here,
Yep.
I go forward, and then I go back here. Okay. Now, we talked a lot about brothers last week, and I wanted to explain why I brought up all these brothers. When you'll be reading, and it'll say 3, no 4, or 6, but 7. It's not like he said 3 and then he goes, "Oh, wait, there's one more." That's not what that language means. When he says there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 which are, it doesn't mean that he almost forgot one. That last one is a special kind of one. It's like it takes the cake. There are 7 things the Lord hates. 7 are an abomination. So that 7th one is going to be the one that is the worst. And if you read that list in Proverbs, that 7th one is spreading strife among brothers. There's something particularly heinous about that to God. And when we were looking at authority and doors, we saw how many stories about brothers and a battle for authority between brothers that these elements kept coming up in. So we looked at not just the battle for authority in terms of who on the outside of it, who corporately, who we recognize as our authority, but also on a very personal level, where we have the soul and the spirit within us, like Paul talked about in Romans, that struggle between the flesh and the spirit, and that the younger should rule over the older, that Jacob and Esau picture that is inside of us, like they were inside of their mother struggling, where we want to put down our nephesh, our flesh, and the New Testament and Old Testament language for that is slightly different, but we're just talking about the soul when we talk about the flesh, and we want the spirit to govern that, mashal that. And so when we talk about the soul or the flesh, the aspects of that were our emotions, our appetite, our desires, and our intellect. And in those stories about brothers, we saw each one of these come up. We saw a failure to govern each aspect here of the soul. In our story of Cain, we saw that Cain failed to govern his emotion, and he was angry, and he killed his brother, which at the time was a huge percentage of the population. That was a disaster. And we see this again when you go to the wilderness. We see Israel, when the 10 spies come back with their report, they fail to govern their fear. And so they make a really bad decision based on emotion. And it results in not just the death of those who change their mind real fast and go running in to try and, oh, we'll do it now. But over the next 40 years, that whole generation dies in the wilderness. Then we move to the battle between, the struggle between Jacob and Esau. And there we saw Esau fail to govern his appetite, and he sells the birthright because he needs to eat, and he needs to eat right now. And we see this again with the Israelites in the wilderness, where a lot of their problems were caused by food and their appetite and what they wanted right now, what they used to have. Okay, so food, it's little wonder that when we come to the end of the age, still food is such an issue.
Well, the Israelites wanted to go back where they could get money.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wanted to go back.
Yeah, I know. In Sodom and in Gibeah, and I'm not saying that Lot was brothers with the people of Sodom, but he does address them as brothers. And now we're talking about brothers not in the sense of brothers, but like we are brothers. Okay, and so in Sodom and Gibeah, you had citizens of those cities that failed to govern their desire. And you see this in the wilderness again with the Midianite women. Moabite? Midianite?
Moabite women, you talking about the Baal-peor?
Baal-peor. And then in Korah's rebellion, you saw Korah who failed to govern his intellect. And this is the one I think that has been the most elusive to me. I don't think I even realized that is actually a problem. I thought it was good to be smart. But it can be a bad thing if you don't govern it. It can be a fleshly thing, and it can lead to pride. And Korah, he had this really good argument for his issue with Moses, because if you think about it, Moses is the only one going into that tent, and the whole assembly, Moses is the only one telling them, this is what God told me in the tent. If we had a single man come to us and say, I talked to God and this is what he said and you have to listen to me, and I'm going to be in charge, and the second in charge is going to be my brother. If there was YouTube back then, there would have been conspiracy videos everywhere about this Moses and the nepotism. But you know, what you have to remember is while he had a really good argument, when Moses came out of those meetings, his face was glowing. He had to wear a veil. Could Korah not see that very clear signal that something bigger is going on here than logic? Apparently he was blind to it because he challenged Moses anyway. And of course that resulted in the earth swallowing thing. And if you go into the future and you look at the conflict that Yeshua is having with the religious leaders of his day, it's kind of the same thing. They think that they're in charge. Intellectually, you know, they've got it all figured out. And here comes this guy. Who does he think he is? And so, again, you have this failure to govern the intellect and to attribute authority where it actually belongs. We then looked at another brother story with Joseph and his brothers, and what's different about this one is, well, all these others, maybe with the exception of Jacob and Esau, but these all ended in disaster. I would say Jacob and Esau was a draw. It's not that Esau submitted himself to Jacob, he just didn't kill him. He just gave him that hug when he came back, but they weren't close. And so in the story with Joseph and his brothers, that's where somebody actually turns it around. Remember that Joseph's brothers wanted to kill him because they didn't, he implied with his dreams that he would rule over them. And we looked at both of those dreams, and the symbols and imagery in those dreams are from day 4. You have the sun, moon, and stars in the one dream, and then you had the sheaves of wheat in the other dream, which is Shavuot. So the door in the story doesn't appear till later, and it's not a real present character in the story. When the brothers make their second trip back into Egypt, they bring Benjamin with them this time, and they're scared because they have that money that was put in their sacks. And so they go to Joseph's house, and it says that they talk with Joseph's servant at the door, and then they go into the house, and when they bow down to him. So I think that's probably your sheaves right there. Then they leave, find the cup, and they end up back. They go into his house again, and this time they fall to the ground. And I think that's your stars dream right there. And at this point, what Judah does is he acknowledges authority before he even knows that it's his brother. He acknowledges that you are the authority. And not only that, but instead of, it would have been real easy for Judah to be angry at Benjamin for taking the cup. We know he didn't, but it would have been real easy for him when they were getting the meal before they left and Benjamin was getting more than everybody else, more stuff. It would have been real easy for him to be jealous, like he was of Joseph. That caused a problem. But he has demonstrated that he is past the jealousy, he's past the anger, past the blaming. All he wants to do is lay down his life, basically, to protect the father and his brother. And that's what our Father is looking for, us to lay down our lives for the Father and our brothers, just like Messiah did. So I think right there you see Judah passing the test, that even though the authority issue is what caused the whole thing, he has repented, he's turned it around, and now you have a good outcome from that situation. So when we think about that, that Judah approaches Joseph, he said, "Can I speak a word in your ear?" And then he tells him, "Take me instead of my brothers, let them go." That this is a guy who's willing to give up his life because of love. And this is similar to what we read in Exodus 21, where if the bondservant who's supposed to be released in the 7th year decides, I love my master and I want to serve him for my life, that he is taken before the judge at the door and the doorpost, and there you will bore a hole in his ear. The ear, the thing we hear the voice with, the voice at the door, an opening of the ear so that we can hear that. And that's I think it's a great picture of us, of the authority, the door, and serving. And if you, hold on, I'm not sure I want to hit this here. If we just poke ahead for just a second, I want to show you another place where you have a door, an ear, and authority. We are going to go ahead, we're going to skip ahead to our, where's our chart? Oh, we're not going to look at the chart. We're just going to go to a letter in Revelation. And it's the Church of Laodicea. It's the one where with each letter he identifies himself as something. And this one, one of his identifiers is the origin of God's creation. And he says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. Now, I think right here, hear my voice and open the door are equivalent expressions. And you'll hear Halissa say this sometimes, that those two are talking about the same thing. And that the knocking is a voice.
Yes, it is.
And to hear the voice is to open the door. And the dining that he has is what Tracy has talked about in the past. The sheep go in and out and find pasture. We're talking about the word that they're dining on. And then he says, to the one who overcomes, I will grant the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. So there we're addressing authority. And that now, just like Peter's been given the keys to the kingdom, because we're acknowledging him as the authority, we get to partake in that authority. Just like Judah got the scepter, because he did that, he approached that correctly. So, and then he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. This is almost like a New Testament Shema, Israel. Hear, O Israel. And if you think about that thing we put on our doorpost, some of us have one, a mezuzah. It's a little container that has the Shema inside of it. It's a thing we nail to our doorpost that has, that's almost like us saying, we've nailed our ear to the door without actually nailing our ear to the door. So as part of your homework, I would like you to read the 2 pieces of scripture that are put into a mezuzah. It's very interesting given what we're talking about now. And I will give you those verse references at the end on your homework sheet. Tracy.
I just
Microphone.
want to share something with all the stuff that you're saying, but I don't want to interrupt you, so like.
No, right now is a good place.
Okay. So, just all these connections with keys and doors. We talked about this before, how the Hebrew word for word is debar, and the Hebrew word picture, dalet, bet, resh, is a door, a house, and a head or most high position. So the word is the door to the house of the Most High, which Messiah is, the Word made flesh. And this got me thinking when you talk about Peter, he said, I give you the keys. Well, he spoke in Luke 11:52 to lawyers, those who held the law, the word. And he says, woe to you, lawyers, you have taken away the key of knowledge. And you did not enter, and you kept others from entering in. Into what? It's got to be the kingdom. Mm-hmm. And so what does he say to Peter after he recognizes who he is? Because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven.
Which is what he says right before that. Uh-huh.
You heard it and he says, I give you the keys to the kingdom. So Messiah, these guys take away the law, Messiah gives it. So this is the word that he's speaking of. And so I'm thinking that's, along with all the authority and stuff you're talking about and the keys, and this overcoming, we can't overcome except by the blood of the Lamb and also by laying down our own lives. And in Isaiah, that talks about the government being laid on his shoulder, which is about the Messiah. Unto us a child is born, a son is given. And the government, the rulership, I will lay on his shoulder. What was laid on his shoulder was the cross. And so we pick up our key and follow him. I think that that's all related. This laying down your life, the word, the door, and going into the kingdom.
Yeah. I want to go back and see if somebody else online had a. Nope. Okay, they're quiet today. All right, I wanted to then go to the parable of the Good Shepherd and still talk about doors for a little bit longer. And
Are
then,
you done with authority and the
No.
conflict with the brothers and whatnot?
oh, with the brothers, yes.
Well, I was just gonna say, you know, you talked about authority and
Microphone.
yeah, I've got it up fairly loud. You guys can hear me, okay? Okay. You talked about this whole issue of authority being, represented by the number 4 stars in heaven, and you've gone through to talk about these brothers and that there's a struggle with authority. What application do you see this having for believers who are reading about this authority issue? How is that relevant to us, would you say? Are you going to deal
Well,
with that later? Or you
In each case where the brothers failed to mashal their own problem within them, it caused massive problems around them. So we need to know that, when you decide to just give in and do something that you shouldn't, which we do every day, just keep in mind, it's not just affecting you. And like I'm one to sit here and just, I think it's more destructive than you may realize. And then the thing about the spreading strife among brothers, to realize just how bad that is, and to be able to spot it and realize that when you've got someone who's doing it, like a troublemaker, that there's a reason why you want to distance from that, because they are a grenade waiting to go off. Tracy?
So I need to.
I'll come over you.
Just seeing the relationship to the brethren in authority is that Moses was the most humble man, and he was given authority. The Messiah says, "I have been given the authority. No one takes my life from me. I do it willingly, and I have the authority to take it and to lay it down and to take it back again." And I think that by through him, we have that same authority, and it comes from humility and from laying our lives down for our brethren. And just like what you said with Judah, it's like he realized, I have to put my life below yours. So that's really where true authority is coming into the picture, with the government on the shoulder. It's laying down your life for your friends.
Can I paint another
Please.
picture? So, going back to what you were saying about the two brothers representing the two versions of ourselves, right? The flesh and spirit. That spirit portion of us is the second born, right? It's the born again picture. I think that's what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
Well, we hear in John that to be born again or born from above, you have to be born of water and spirit, right? And this is the very picture that we see in the transfiguration and who the Messiah is with, right? He's with Moses
Water.
and Elijah.
Yeah.
Moses is the water, Elijah is the spirit. And the water of the word was given on the fourth feast, Shavuot, and the spirit on Shavuot, the fourth feast. So I think those born again pictures and that authority and the brothers all kind of tie together that way.
That's,
Michael?
Thanks, guys. In the parable of the Good Shepherd, he says, "He who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. And he says, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. If anyone enters through me, he shall be saved and go in and out and find pasture." And I want you to remember that in and out, because that is a movement associated with the four and the door. A door swings back and forth. There's this back and forth movement. That's why I picked what are those called? Saloon doors, because they go back and forth. And I wanted that to be the type of movement that you remember that goes with that opening. After this, he says, like Tracy just said, that the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And after that, he says, like Tracy just said, I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it back up. Now, this Good Shepherd parable, when this is happening, this is directly connected to the healing of the man born blind that we talked about on day one. This is one of these runs into the other. There's an unfortunate chapter break between John 9 and 10 that makes you almost think that you've switched scenes, but you haven't. The camera's still rolling, and I'll show you how those go together in just a minute. Remember that in that event, just previous to this, he's healed the man, and he's towards the end of that, he's having a discussion with that man, and he tells him, for judgment I have come into this world so that the blind may see, and those who see may become blind. And how many times do we find the judge at the door? He's come into this world for judgment, so the blind can see, and those who see become blind. Now, some of the Pharisees were with him when he said that to the man who he'd healed. And they said, are we blind too? And he said to them, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But since you claim you can see, your guilt remains. And this sounds a lot like, you say, I am wealthy, I have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked, which is what we're going back to, that same letter we just looked at, the Laodicea letter. And right after that, he says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Now, the solution there to that, what I think Laodicea needs to do is hear the voice and recognize God's authority. I wanted to show you how this runs, how the first event runs into the second. Right after he says, but since you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door, but goes in some other way into the fold of the sheep, is a thief and a robber. Then he says the good shepherd lays down his life. He who is not a shepherd, the hireling, sees the wolf and runs away, and the wolf snatches the sheep and scatters them. So here we have the wolf is back around the blindness and the door. And I got to thinking about this, and this almost sounds like a dig at the religious authorities and what's about to happen, because these Pharisees or religious leaders that he's talking to are the hirelings. They're not the good shepherd. And when they see the wolf, they will run away. And the wolf, the Roman Empire, is going to snatch the sheep and scatter them. And for the next few hundred years, that's what you're going to see. Now, the scattering is going to be good because it's going to spread it over the face of the earth, just like we're about to see day 5 is about. So that scattering isn't a bad thing, but that Roman Empire is that, I think, that wolf that he's talking about, or one way to look at this. The Roman Empire, actually, their origin mythology involves twins who were left by the river, found by a wolf who nurtured them, and then the shepherd picks up some wolf in sheep's clothing. The shepherd raises them without actually knowing who they are, basically children of a wolf, and then later one of them kills the other because his brother, there was a dispute about who had the favor of the gods, Cain and Abel. So it's like this monstrous Frankenstein story of elements that we've looked at in our, so they're, you know, it's always copying, isn't he, the adversary? It's always stealing. He is a thief. Anyway, so I wanted to ask you now what you had, I asked you in your homework to read about day 5 and then to think about day 5 compared to day 3 and what type of connections you found between those 2 days. Anybody? Common themes or some kind of relationship?
You go, girl.
Just a couple things that the trees and the plants were noted as being after their own kind, and the birds and fish were according to their own kind, so there was a similarity there. And then the trees were producing fruit, and the birds and fish were told to be fruitful and multiply. Those are the only things that really popped out at me. I was just reading them at face value.
Yep. Anybody else?
What was the question again?
The relationship between 3 and 5. Because on our menorah, remember that when you have 2 that come out at the same point on the branch, that there's a relationship between
Well,
those
that would
2.
have to do with balance,
Yes.
right?
Yes. The 1st and the 7th are connected. 2nd and 6th, 3rd and 5th. So as we go along, we look at the connection across. Okay, let's go with the day 5 slide there. I gave you the bunch of birds in the sky and a big swarm of fish underneath the water. I kind of just put those on top of each other. The letter is the He letter, and that's breath, movement of air, spirit. That's the feminine. When you have a feminine Hebrew word, it has a He on the end of it, generally. And then it's also used as a the. If you wanted to say
The man.
the man, it would be ha-ish instead of just ish. Did I say that as ish? Okay. Ha. They know.
Ask your kids, they know everything.
And ish-ah, I saw you. And ish-ah is a woman. Okay. Let's go to the text of day. I'm trying. The text of day 5, and it says, then God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living souls, and let birds fly above the earth in the expanse of the heavens. And God created the great sea monsters and every living soul that moves, with which the waters swarm, after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. There was evening, there was morning, a 5th day. Okay, swarming swarms. Do you remember with day 5? With the 5, remember swarming swarms, because we're going to see that start to come up. And you can already, if you've read Revelation once, you remember there's a swarm there too. That's a bad swarm. These are good swarms. These swarms move on currents of air and currents of water. And they migrate they migrate according to their times and seasons so they can be in a favorable place and that they can multiply. You see the birds migrating, and if they're out of place, it could result in a mass die-off, which we have seen. Or this poor goose that is he missed the ride back home, And for a couple weeks, he sat on top of the office building back here and just honked all morning long, all by himself. I felt so bad for him because I know they mate for life. Anyway, so we need to be in the right place at the right time. And that's what these creatures are teaching us. You got rapid movement on the currents of air, the currents of water. They keep their times and seasons. Those are like the things I want you to try and remember in your head. Swarming swarms, rapid movement, great numbers, keeping their times and seasons. Okay, the birds are the first creature to breathe air. And this is the first day that God blesses his creation. Okay, the connection to the third day being where the dry land appeared and then the trees and plants sprouted. The fish breed and feed in those gathered waters. The birds breed and feed on the ground and in the trees that he created. The fish they're concealed beneath the water, but the birds are visible in the air. When you get to the New Testament, you still have a really strong connection between birds and fish. He says to his disciples he wants to make them fishers of men. And I kind of want to talk about what that means and how it's related to what you're seeing on day 5. Remember the 2 miraculous catches of fish. There were so many fish that it was tipping the boat, or sinking the boat and ripping the net. That happens twice. And it's right after that, one of those, that he says to Peter and his brother, I'll make you fishers of men. This commission to be fishers of men is pulling people out of the water and into the air. Out of death and breathing the spirit, the air. You see the juxtaposition of birds and fish in Jonah, where you have a bird, Jonah, a dove, means dove, in the water, and then he transitions from a fish into a bird on dry land. And I think when Yeshua sends his disciples out, that the result is a giant catch of fish. We're talking swarming swarms now, being pulled out of the water, and those fish become air-breathing, spirit-filled doves, flying in the open expanse, multiplying rapidly, spreading seeds, word, all over the face of the earth, making more after their kind. And now we're talking metaphorically. You with me?
No.
Okay.
Did you just suddenly switch to speaking in metaphors?
I was all along.
I'm kidding.
It's Pharisees.
Okay, this is a picture of the resurrection, going from the water to the air, from the fish to a bird, like Jonah after 3 days, the plants sprouting on day 3. You got the resurrection, sign of the resurrection, 3. And then later, we're going to see those doves returning home, like in Isaiah, where he says, what is this cloud of doves I see returning to their home? And if we look at Numbers chapter 10, and this is a little revisit back to Jonah, we have the inverted noons. The inverted
nuns.
The inverted nuns. The inverted noons. Okay, it's that special little. Never mind. It's that special little section in Numbers that is set off by the noons that are flipped backwards, and that noon, that letter, is a picture of a fish jumping out of the water. A fish coming out of the water and in the air, okay? Resurrection, eternal life. And you have this statement by Moses that is set off by those brackets, the eternal life brackets, that says, whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Rise up, may your enemies be scattered, may your foes flee before you." When it came to rest, he said, "Return, Lord, to the countless thousands of Israel, the swarm.
And you kind of look like brackets.
Yeah. So I wanted you to see what happens right before this section. You have, and I don't think I have a slide for this, no. Right before this in Numbers chapter 10, that's where I am, you have the instructions for making 2 silver trumpets and the instructions for assembling the congregation and for marching out in battle array. And in and out is battle language. And their movements, whether they congregate or whether they start to march out, rapidly moving in great numbers, is based on that sound of the trumpet. And there are different trumpet blasts to indicate what they're supposed to do. So there's a lot of noise and a lot of movement going on with this swarm of people. Right after this, you have the 70 elders, and then you have the quail incident, where you have a swarm of quail. Now, this is a bad swarm, because this swarm is moving out of time and season. They're not where they're supposed to be. They were brought in by a wind, and they were...
Didn't they come from Egypt?
Yeah. And we talked about how the doves out of season, you can normally eat dove or quail and be fine, but a quail that it has been off its migration route could have eaten some, I think, hemlock, and it causes kidney failure if you eat it. So, and that may have been what happened here, or it may just, I don't know. But remember that the timing is important, that the first swarm, the group that's moving out in battle array, is moving according to the sound of the trumpet. This swarm of birds was moving because the Israelites' appetite, their craving. In fact, this place is called the Graves of Craving after a bunch of them die from that, and that's a failure to govern their appetite. So I wanted to go back to, I wanted to go back to our chart, and I circled all the 5s. Right now we're going across and we're doing the 7 days of creation. And then eventually we'll get to the 7 spirits and the 7, so we're moving from left to right and then moving down, and that's how we're going through the study. But every once in a while I like to jump ahead. And right now I just want to circle all those 5s and have you see how the birds and the fish and the swarming and the movement are tied to the Feast of Trumpets. And this, I think that the 5s here are going to be the easiest one to see the connection with when we get to talking about how Rosh Hashanah is observed and the letter to Sardis. It's going to be, this is the one where there's just unmistakably linked. And I think that that's good, because that's the one that we need to understand. Because I think we are that army waiting for the sound of the trumpet for our instructions. And all of the first 4 of those feasts have had huge fulfillments. This is the next one in the group. And so I think it's good that when we get done with the whole study, I think you'll have a much better idea of what those instructions were to Sardis and why and what that means and how it's tied so well to what you're seeing in Revelation. Some things that were confusing. Okay, and then as a teaser, that Yom Teruah, it has 3 different names. It can be called Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, the day of blowing, wind, current, or Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. And it has a nickname. It's called the day that no man knows. So that, I think that we've all heard that and been like, oh. And the reason why it's the day that no man knows is because they wait for the sighting of the moon. And I read an article, just briefly, and I would like to read that more before we get there, that the way they do that is they wait for word from 2 witnesses. So there we have the 2 witnesses that are so mysterious. So maybe we'll learn some more about that too. Okay,
You said the 2 witnesses were the trumpet and the moon?
no, they wait for 2 witnesses who have sighted the moon to announce that it is now Yom Teruah, the first of the month, for that one.
Is that the only feast that
I
occurs on the first of the month?
Don't,
Yeah. Yes.
it is.
That's why it's called the day that no man knows.
Yeah, you can't plan ahead. You can't plan ahead.
You can't plan ahead.
Okay. All right, let's go back and now we will,
Swarms.
hey, swarming swarms.
Those are cricket bugs. No.
Those are locusts. That's the locust plague that invaded India. I wanted to talk about, now that we've kind of reviewed all of these, huh?
Back to the people.
Oh, sorry. Hi, guys. All right. Now that we've done all that, what I wanted to do was look at the undoing of creation. I want you to consider the flood, the plagues of Egypt, and what you've read about the events of Revelation as an undoing of creation. These elements of creation that we've been looking at are reversed, distorted, or just out of place. The flood, the upper and lower waters have unseparated, and now we're all covered in water again. The dry land, instead of coming out, submerged. The trees and plants are also covered, and everything with breath dies. In Egypt, it gets a little more complex. Light and dark, instead of being sequential, day and the night, are side by side, Egypt and Goshen. So what used to happen like this is now wrong. You have the waters split side by side when they go through the Red Sea, and then they come back together and destroy Pharaoh. You have the gatherings of waters. When he turns the Nile to blood, he lists off different types of waters, and one of them is their mitzvah of water, their pools, their gatherings of waters, are now turned to blood. You have this is all from day 3, the plants, the trees, and all green things devoured. You have swarms of frogs that are not where they should be. Remember, they're in their kneading bowls and their ovens. They're not in the river. Things are out of place. You have lice and you have flies, which that word for flies has the connotation of not like a bunch of black house flies invaded, but a mixture of flying things. A swarm that was mixed. It's not after it like kind, it's a mixing. And we know that's bad.
What's that?
I said, that's terrible.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that one was only an annoyance. No, I think was that one the one that destroyed the earth? Yeah, okay. They're destroying instead of spreading. Instead of multiplying, they're destroying. Instead of the earth bringing forth man and beast like it did on day 6, you have the dust turns into lice, and then the lice turn on man and beast. And then instead of rest, Pharaoh increases their labor. And so you have this backwardness that is happening. It's like an unraveling of creation. Now, in Revelation, you have the same thing again, only it's ramped up again, where there's darkness, there's problems with water, problems with the trees and the plants, the sun and the moon and the stars are now involved in it. And you have swarms, you have beasts, okay? In each of these cases, preservation is provided by going through a door, in and out. Noah and his family and the animals that were preserved went into the ark. God shut the door, and when all waters receded, came out of the ark. We saw it in Sodom, where Lot went into the house and then out, and he and his daughters were preserved and taken out of judgment and destruction. The Israelites, when they came out of Egypt, they put the blood on their door, they went in, passed over, they came out, and then they left. The sheep go in and out. This is our battle movement, to go in and out. their ear is pierced against the door. They listen to the voice. Their ears open to the one at the door. And I think that these 7 letters in Revelation are kind of our instructions. Like Noah was given his instructions for the ark. I think those 7 letters are our instructions for the end of the age. And again, I'll probably say this every time we meet. I think it's really important that we know what they're saying, because each one of them says, "He who overcomes." And we got to figure out what is it we're overcoming and how do we overcome it, and that it's he who has an ear, repeated every single letter, to hear what the Spirit has to say. So that is all I have besides your homework. Did anybody out there have a comment or a question or an insight before I get the homework?
Yes. I will say this. Can you guys hear me online? Okay. This is you've talked a lot about authority from heaven, and that I think that the overall gist of it, if I may say, is that we need to submit to the authority of the Messiah. He has submitted to the authority of his Father. We need to overcome our own flesh. And this just reminds me of something interesting, and I don't want you to misconstrue or misunderstand what I'm about to say to be a political statement, because it has absolutely zero to do with politics or the way that politics are playing out in America today. It is not about that at all. What it is about is I hear a lot of people out there who are, really into politics, or they just, everything is political to them. And I have a friend of mine who was like, I mentioned previously about the vaccine stuff, that he was like, if they try to force me to take the vaccine, I will literally take my family and go hide in the wilderness and live in the desert. And something just occurred to me. I don't even know where this came from, but something that I had read with the children in Jeremiah chapter 40 through 47 just popped into my mind. You know what that was? Does anybody know their book of Jeremiah well enough? This is when God had appointed the Babylonians as a rod of punishment for the Israelites. And many of the Israelites were wanting to fight the Babylonians, were wanting to flee to Egypt to get away from the persecution. And God spoke through the prophet Jeremiah and said, I have appointed the Babylonians for you. Submit and you will live. Try to flee to Egypt and you will die. The sword and the pestilence and the famine will pursue you right where you go. And do you think that there was a political turmoil in the days of Yeshua?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely there was. Do you think that it is for no reason that the disciples said, and they tried to test him, not the disciples, but some Pharisees or the teachers of the law tried to test him and say, is it okay that we pay taxes to Caesar? What did he say? What do I care about Caesar?
Yeah.
Caesar has nothing to do with me. You render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and you render unto God that which is God's. I only say this to you for the sake of possibly thinking and talking to people around you who might be really highly agitated by the political scene or the way that the country's going. Did it ever occur to you that God appointed this for you?
Yeah.
That when you have an unrighteous society, you must be ruled by a tyrant. That's the way it works. If you will not govern yourself, God will govern you by a tyrant. If you want to have righteous leadership, be righteous. Turn from your own sins and control your own flesh and submit to the authority that God has put under you.
And
Over you, excuse me.
And don't move when it's not the time or season before the trumpets. Don't go in and out. Don't get all lined up for battle on your own timing.
Well, we know there, according to Jewish legend, there was that guy who thought it's time to cross the Red Sea, and he started walking across and he drowned.
Yeah.
Well, the time wasn't right. That's just Jewish legend, but
Well, that was when he said, "Be still."
yeah,
It's
be
time
still and
there's times to sit still
yeah.
and wait.
So I say, learn to submit and control your own flesh, and you'll be in a much better position, period. There's a but?
Yep.
There's a stinky but. Let's hear it,
There's a
Lou.
but. Well, what you're saying is true. But,
That's not a but.
yet we have to really, we all move too fast. We don't sit and rely on God's presence in the things that we do.
Yeah.
We just move too fast.
Yeah.
We don't realize that God is with us every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
It always reminds me of that poem where he's on his shoulders and you say, how come you haven't been, well, I've been right with you all the time.
He's gonna carry them.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a great observation, Lou. And I would say that one of the things you might think about is that during that same period of Jeremiah that I was just talking about, Daniel and his friends got taken to Babylon. They submitted to the authority of the king of Babylon, except in two things. What were those two things?
Diet.
Food
Listening to God.
and idolatry. Where have you heard that before?
Acts.
Acts chapter 15. So, submit to the authority. But if the authority says you must do this and God says you must not do that, then you can kill me. Then you can kill me. If you tell me that I have to do something that God tells me not to do, then you can kill me. If you tell me that I must not do something that God tells me I must do, then you can kill me. Otherwise, I'll do what you say. It doesn't affect me. Right?
And they were preserved.
And they were preserved miraculously. So I think Americans are just naturally rebellious. We were born in rebellion, and we have to really kind of get that under control because we're just fiercely independent. And there's a good side to that, but there's also a bad side to that. We don't have a whole lot of respect for authority, period. And the respect for authority that we have in this country it's gone. We need to be
We've seen that in the last year with the
We have.
swarms.
Swarming in the streets, rejecting authority. We want to submit to authority to the extent that we can and should, and be people of peace who submit to authority that God has placed over us.
I have just some goofy questions, and I don't expect them to be answered thought about. So, I know in the workbook, she says how the first created substance is the light. But when I read the scripture, it sounds like God created the heavens and the earth, because the earth is already there and it's formless and void, and there was darkness over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. So there's heavens, earth, darkness, waters, and then light. So I'm just wondering where those things came from. And then she also talks about that the light was obedient, separate from the darkness. I think of obedience as something that a conscious decision is made. So it makes me wonder about does light have the opportunity to be disobedient?
Those are great questions, Carla. I think that I can't answer your first question, but I know that some people try to by looking at the gap theory, which is a fantastic little box of worms that you can open up. That's quite fascinating. So look at that if you want to. As to your second question, that's a great question that needs more pondering.
I think with the first one, I kind of saw that too, but it's the first where he says, "Let there be light." So it's the first thing that is a response to something he has said. The rest of it, it's describing the state of things. So that might be why she might be like looking at the 10 utterances of creation and going with light as the first response to his first utterance, or God said.
What did she say about light?
She was saying
The
that
first created substance.
that like light was obedient. It's the first created thing. But there's some interesting insights.
That it's the
there.
first response to something that God has said. like the words of
He
God.
doesn't actually say create light. He says be light in Hebrew. It's just be light.
Yeah, just
That's
be
all he
light,
says.
right.
So I mean, it's like
But light was, so it followed God's command. So it was. It's I suppose it's appropriate to say that light was obedient and
well, he
did.
tells you to be light,
There you go.
and we have the opportunity
Yeah,
to be obedient.
and I think that I'm not sure that any creature really has an or creation really has an opportunity to be disobedient except for us. and maybe the light was supposed to be like a figure lesson about that. I think everything else is following its instructions or is responding to the mess that we made by being disobedient.
Cool. Any other comments, questions, or concerns that you have? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just thinking, I just read this last night, you asked the question, I don't remember how you just worded it, but how does that apply to us with the nefesh and the flesh and all this? I just read last night that you have your spirit and God, and the ego stands in between, ego being the flesh. That would be why it would apply to us, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good insight. I like that.
Yeah.
Very good. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I suppose that we